get started. Um, so to start, there's this guy who went out on a journey to start out and figure out all you need to know for personal finance. And he did a bunch of research and he was going to write a big book on it. And then he decided not to because he was like, there's really only these things that you need to know. And there's not really much more to expound on. This is a little bit out of our age bracket, but I still thought it was a good intro. So the first thing is he says, make a will. Eventually you'll have to do that. I don't know the importance of that right now. But the second thing, pay off your credit card balance. Third thing, term life insurance instead of whole life insurance. Again, not really as important. Fund your company's 401k to the max. Fund your Roth IRA to the max. We'll talk about those later. Buy a house if you can afford it and you will live in it. That's key. So being able to live in your house and not just kind of buying a house for the sake of buying a house. Additionally, put 6 months of living expenses in a money market account. Then take all, and we'll talk about what that is. That's kind of like an emergency fund. Then take all of the extra money you have and invest 70% in a stock index fund and 30% in a bond fund through a discount broker. Again, this is not exactly, don't take these at face value at the moment, but we'll get into them. And then don't touch your money until you retire. And then for anything outside of things like this, hire a fee-based financial advisor and not someone working on commission. We'll talk about all of that, but I just thought it was a good intro. To continue, I'm going to go through some important concepts to start. Then we're going to talk about understanding your income. Then we're going to talk a little bit about taxes, financial structure, so where your money should be held. Then we'll talk about investing and what to invest in and how to invest. We'll talk about long-term versus short-term capital gains and the implications there. We'll talk about debt, credit cards, housing, and cars. So I know that there is probably a varying level of understanding of different financial terms. So I was going to start with a very basic introduction into some things that you may not know, but you may intuitively know, but just not know the name of, but are good to know and good to understand what they actually mean. So the first one of those is interest. And when you think about interest, it's really the amount that it costs you to borrow money or the amount that you get for lending someone your money. So when you take out buy a house, for example, you'll take out a loan from a bank. And if you take out a $100,000 loan from a bank and you're paying 4% interest, that means the interest you pay a year is $4,000. It's just 4% times $100,000. And then you also will pay the principal, but that's another thing. So it's just like when you own a bond, for example, and that means that you put your money into an account and you're basically giving someone your money and they're going to give you money back. They'll pay you interest for you holding that money every year. They'll pay you to have your money temporarily, and then they'll give you your money at the end back. So when we talk about interest, like we often kind of think about it in terms of like a return as well. So you get money, it's like the money you get back for giving someone your money, or the inverse as well. Then inflation. Inflation is a topic that I think a lot of people understand, but it's basically money becomes less valuable. Cash generally becomes less valuable over time because prices go up. So prices going up means your money today will be worth less in the future. Generally, as a rule of thumb, we think about inflation as 2% a year. So on average, prices of goods and services will go up about 2% a year. So actually, by holding cash and not by investing it, you'd be suffering the penalty of inflation. Now, it's like a cost to having cash. So that's the inflation topic. Then we're going to talk about and I'm going to explain these, but then if you don't fully get it, then just move on and Google it and start like learning about, but these are good concepts to understand in general. Then there's an opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is, think of it like if you put your money in one place or you use your money for one thing, you could have used it for another thing. So if I use my money to buy a house and I put 20% down and I put money into that house. I could have alternatively taken that money and put it in, say, the stock market and had that money make money with a different return mechanism. So I could have there's an opportunity cost. There's a cost associated with me putting my money in one place versus another. It's basically you could have done this or you do that, and there's an opportunity cost to doing whatever you do with money. And then compounding returns. So compounding returns is, if you think about it, so say something increases by 10% a year. In years one, say I give you $100, and in year two it grows 10%. So you have now $110. Well, in year three, so you've made $10 in year one. Now in year three, it grows 10% again. It will go up to $121. So you'll have made $11. And the compounding returns is actually the money that you make on your money grows over time because you have more money growing. So that's a concept of compounding returns. Present value. This is the sum of all the money that it's some of the future money that you have. If you were to take a stream, like money in the future. So say what's the difference between money today? It's a difference between money today and money in 10 years. For example, if I gave you $100 today versus $100 in 10 years, you would rather have the $100 today. And so there's a present value to that $100 in the future. And that $100 in the future is actually less valuable to you than the $100 today. And so there's a way to calculate what that money is worth using different interest assumptions. And so it's basically just understanding the difference between what money is worth today versus money in the future. That's one other thing that you might want to research a little bit more. Then there's diversification of risk. If you have all your eggs in one basket, it's more risky than putting money in a number of different places or in a number of different investments that are more or less that are more independent, and that so you don't, if one thing goes wrong in what you have money in, then it won't hurt you as bad. Cognitive biases. These are things that we all do by nature that are hard to really understand. So it's like there's like an recency bias. There's a confirmation bias. So recency bias is things that happen more recently. You think will happen more, like you think they happen. They're more likely to happen. There is a confirmation bias. If something happens and it confirms what you think, then that basically it's like reassures you that would happen. And there's a bunch of different of these things that occur that we think about that can influence the way we manage money and think about our money. And so if you just open up that PDF and read through that, that's a worthwhile investment in time. And then lastly, appreciation and depreciation. So a lot of times you'll hear cars a depreciating asset, and this just means it's worth less as you own it longer. The resale value goes down. Some people think that houses are appreciating assets, that housing prices will increase. And I mean, that can be true, that cannot be true, but just understanding whether something that you own appreciates in value or depreciates in value can affect whether or not that's a good thing to own. And there's different reasons why you would own an appreciating asset versus a depreciating asset. So those are some concepts, and they are good to understand. And I think if you grasp those, it'll be a lot easier to work your way through financial decisions in the future, just thinking in the terms of those concepts. So next, I'm going to talk about understanding your income. And I think this is important, but I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time on it. Just what I mean by this is really just understanding how you make money, how likely you are to keep making money, when what might cause you to stop making money, and how risky is your income. So one thing that I wanted to include in here that I've talked about with some friends before is just the value in negotiating your salary. If you, I can draw it on this, yeah. So if you see here in this example, there's two different people. There's a guy named Taylor and a guy named Alex, and basically this shows you the amount of money that Taylor will make over his career versus Alex when you compare their different behaviors. So Taylor in the beginning negotiates a $5,000 higher salary to start, and he also negotiates, in addition to his 1% raise per year, he negotiates a 4% raise every 3 years versus just a 1% raise each year. So at the end of his career, Taylor ends up making $50,000 more at retirement and 1.06 million more over his career. And this is the article that it's linked to. Basically, that by negotiating your salary, we're taking advantage and getting that extra 4% raise or getting that extra $5,000 at the start, if you can, and asking for it will help you in the long run because of those compounding returns that we talked about. If you have if your $5,000 more at the beginning grows by a percent extra a year, that is a meaningful difference at the end of it, and especially if you're getting in another 4% raise. So just understanding that actually there's long-term effects to negotiating your salary as well, because that's the baseline for your next salary. And then over here I have how risky is your income. For example, like a nurse versus an actor. Maybe if you're an actor, you make money all at once, but you don't know when you're going to have your next job or when the next movie or whatever. So you might need to save more money versus a nurse who's fairly job secure and likely wouldn't lose his or her job, might be able to take a riskier investment approach because they know that they're confident that money is going to come in the future. And again, this is just an example, but I think especially today, it's particularly important. Now we're going to talk about, I'm going to erase that real quick. Now I'm going to talk about taxes real quick. This is just a slide that will show you kind of at a high level all you really need to know about your taxes. Sorry about that. So there's three numbers that are really important: your adjusted gross income, your tax rate, and your tax credits. So your adjusted gross income is all the money you make minus, in most cases, the standard deduction, which is just the number that the federal government has decided is the deduction amount, or your itemized deductions. Most young people will probably just use the standard deduction. Itemized deductions, you can, instead of taking, if you're able to deduct certain expenses like medical expenses, state and local taxes, mortgage loan interest, charitable contribution, of course, gambling losses that exceed income, you will be able to itemize your deductions and take that instead of the standard deduction, actually be more beneficial for you. And so it's basically just the difference between those two numbers. Then you get your tax rate. We have four components of taxes: federal taxes, FICA taxes, which is basically Social Security and Medicare, state and local taxes. I suggest that everyone go on to this tax calculator and just put in their numbers at the beginning and say like, well, this is about what I would expect my tax rate to be in the future. And then here we have, what are your tax credits? These are reductions to the amount of taxes that you owe after the amount of money that you owe is calculated. So a few examples: the earned income tax credit, which is like a low wage tax credit. It's given to under a certain income bracket, you get basically X number of dollars off your tax expense. There's a child tax credit, similar thing. If you have children, you get certain deductions for just having children and from your taxes. And then this is an interesting one too that I thought was useful. The American Opportunity Tax Credit. If you make, I think I'm going to say this right. If you make under $50,000 a year, you can expense tax-free. You can get a tax credit for up to $2,000 a year in educational expenses. So if you wanted to take a night class, for example, at a grad school or something like that, $2,000 of those costs would be completely free to you if you make under a certain income. So there's all these different tax credits that you may or may not get that kind of help you. How to do your taxes? I would like definitely suggest using TurboTax. Most taxes are relatively simple, and TurboTax is super easy. Um, they do try to scam you out of every possible dollar because their goal is to make money, and they've actually gotten in trouble for this in the past. If you make less than $36,000 a year, these services are entirely free to you, TurboTax or H&R Block, so you should not be paying for them online. Beyond that, just pay as little as you can to do your taxes. As you earn more, it may make sense to use an accountant. It's worth the cost because it's just a convenience thing. And then deductions and credits can be complicated depending on your situation, but I would suggest at least trying to work through with one of those online tax services first because they're fairly cheap and easy to use, and they can be free. Moving forward, okay. So this is something that I get asked occasionally, and it's just like, where do you keep your money, and what's the best way to keep your money in different places? So I see it as there's basically three different types of accounts that you might need. It's your checking account, your savings account, money market account, and an investment account. So your checking account, as you see there, it's like the money that you need. This is generally just held in cash. Your savings account is money that you might need. And again, cash, more or less. And then your investment account is the money that you don't need, cash, stocks, bonds. So I'm going to go through these each through. Your checking account, I would try to keep this account as poor as possible because one of those human things that we do is when you spend less when you feel like you have less. If you feel like you have more money, you'll spend more money. So by keeping your checking account as poor as possible, if you spend through your checking account and use your debit card or use your credit card, we'll talk about that later. And if you keep this account poor, you'll just end up spending less, and that'll help in the long run you to build your investment account. Try to only hold 2 weeks worth of your everyday expenses. So those are expenses excluding rent, housing, and student debts in this account. So I'm talking about like expenses like food, entertainment, dining, gifts. I didn't include here, but like utilities. I guess that would be included in housing. Basically, if you get paid every 2 weeks, you should only have you try to keep only those next 2 weeks worth of money in here because you really don't need more money than that in there after you pay your rent, your housing, and your student debt. And this is what people talk about, making a budget. I would try to estimate what that number is for you and hold yourself to it. So after you get paid, first pay off those student debts, housing, utilities, and then if there's money left in your account, this is just what I would suggest. This is based on what I do and what I think is good advice and helps you save. I would just try to transfer any money you don't need into your money market / savings account or investment account. Additionally, I would also suggest when you are planning a vacation or slightly abnormal expense, try to pay for it with the living expense balance you have afforded yourself. So that budget, and then that might mean pulling back other spending on a couple pay cycles and saving up for that. But I think that actually will help in the long run if you can. Again, and this is just suggested things, like it might be hard to do these things and such, but just these are different ways that you can make yourself spend less money, but you might not even feel it as much. Then we're going to talk about, so this money market savings account. This is an important thing I think that people should have in some form. It's just an emergency fund in case you lose a job, in case of an emergency medical procedure. I have a friend who he got bit by a snake, and he needed to pay for an emergency medical procedure. This helped him out, but so generally people suggest that you build this to 3 to 6 months of your monthly expenses. So housing, utilities, student debts, living expenses. But when you're younger, in your 20s and 30s, and you don't have many liabilities, I honestly, like 3 months is probably good. You could do a little bit less. You could do a little bit more. But I would build this up just to have a reserve account so you have it in case something bad happens. And I would never take money out of this account unless you absolutely have to. And I'll explain the difference real quick between a money market and a savings account. So a savings account is the main difference is the level of access that you have to your money and the interest rate that money earns. So In a money market account, for example, you'll have slightly higher interest rates. So maybe they'll put your money into some sort of investment product that'll grow at 1.5% a year instead of the 0.05 or 0.25% you get in a savings account. I suggest you get a money market account if you can. Usually your banks will have these available to you. You can call them up and consult with them. I linked here the rates that money market accounts get. And again, that's just the concept of your money earning money while sitting in this savings account. You're just passively getting 2% or 1.5% a year. Once you're comfortable with this this savings account, I would then suggest that you start taking any extra money that you don't need for daily living and start investing it. And I'm going to talk about that. So the question that gets asked a lot is, well, how much should you save or how much should you invest? There's like a number of different rules that people talk about with this. There's the 15% rule, which is just 15% of your pre-tax salary you should save. There's the 50-30-20 rule, which is your after-tax money. You should be spending 50% of it on essentials like housing, utilities, phone bill, food. Then you should spend 30% of it on discretionary spending like entertainment, trips, gifts, eating out, and then you should save 20% of it. And then there's also a savings rule where you should have 1 times your salary at 30 saved by 30. You should have 2 times your salary at 35 saved by 35, 3 times by 40 saved by 40, and so on. So 4 times by 45. There's a number of different ways that target goals here. But the reality is there's a lot of different situations and scenarios, and you have to decide what's right for you and what you're able to do. But when making that decision, an important thing to keep in mind is when invested in stocks, realize that, and this is kind of a rule of thumb, but so don't take it, we can't take this as gospel, but as a rule of thumb, when invested in stocks, we think that we'll get $1 today will equal $2 in 10 years in nominal terms. So nominal terms being in actual dollars. In real terms, which factors in things costing more, which factors in price inflation that we were talking about earlier, in 14, your money will double in 14 years in real terms. So it's like I just gave you $2 today and you went out and spent it. And that continues to happen. So $1 today will then equal $4 in 20 years and $8 in 30 years. So just keep that in mind when you're looking today. You may be 20, I'm 24, and if I think about saving $1 today versus spending $1 today, if I'm going to spend that $1, I at least know that $1 today could be worth $8 when I'm 54, and that I can establish a trade-off there just because I know at least I know that, so I'm able to make that decision. But I don't think a lot of people can do really think in that terms enough. So as much as you can get yourself thinking in that way, it'll help down the long run. And then, so how should you invest? So one of the things that gets talked about is like IRAs and 401ks a lot. So I'm going to just explain those a little bit. Basically, two main bullet points. If you can invest with tax-free money and or with money matched by your employer, do that first. And then try your best to save enough to get the full employer match if you receive one. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that. So a number of employers will offer 401ks or Roth 401ks with or without a company matching program that you will want to max out your contributions to that first. So this is just a savings. This is an investment account. It's a lot of them go through Fidelity. Basic and the matching is if you put $1 of money into this account, maybe your employer matches 25% of that dollar. So they'll put a quarter in with you. So the reason you want to max out your employer match is because they're basically just giving you more money. They're just paying you more. So if you can save as much to fully max that out, you're getting free extra money from your employer. So if you have one of those programs, definitely use a 401k, because it can be very useful. So there's a distinction here too between a 401k and a Roth 401k. Roth 401k is not used as much, but basically the only difference is you pay taxes on the way out with a 401k, and you pay taxes on the way in with a Roth 401k. So you should only use a Roth 401k if you expect your tax rate at retirement to be higher than it is today. Most people, this is not the case. But if you have a relatively low federal tax rate, which going back to that tax calculator we were talking about, you may consider this as an option. And explaining why this happens, 401ks are non-Roth 401ks are tax deductible. It's a rule that it's a way that the federal government set up to incentivize people to save, so you don't have to pay taxes. It's like a reduction to your adjusted gross income that I was talking about earlier. The max you can contribute to both types of these in 2020 is $19,500. So if your employer, additionally, really easy, if your employer offers you one of these, you'll probably find out upon getting hired, and just ask someone that you work with to explain it to you how to best take advantage, because I'm sure that they've done it before. Additionally, if you work for a nonprofit, a government organization, or other qualified employers, your version of a 401k is a 403b. It's basically the same thing. But be aware of fees in these 403bs, because for some reason, there's a lot of scammy stuff that goes on in 403bs, where people are just kind of taking exorbitant fees. Because you have less oversight of your money, usually they just kind of put you in something. So just understand the fees that you're paying. I'm going to get into that a little bit. Okay, moving forward. Now, if your employer doesn't offer you a 401k or a Roth 401k, or you have maxed out your $19,500 contribution and wish to invest more, you should then consider a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA. And so do these in this order. Drop through this list. The max limit for a personal IRA contribution is $6,000. If you do not have an employee-sponsored plan, you can max out this $6,000. If you do have an employee-sponsored plan, so those 401ks that we were talking about, you can still contribute. However, you are subject to more restrictions depending on your income. So I linked right here what those restrictions are. So you can still contribute to these. And then lastly, similar tax rules apply to IRAs. If you have a higher tax rate now, you should invest pre-tax dollars using a traditional IRA, whereas if not, you should use a Roth IRA. Finally, if you are able to contribute more money after maxing out the above contributions, you should consider opening a personal investment account. And that, now I'm going to get into what provider should you use for that personal investment account. So if you go through your employer, they'll put you in a system. Usually it's Fidelity for your 401k. Now, if you're able to open up a personal investment account, which is just I think it's called, per tax purposes, like just investment account, whereas those are called IRA, 401k. There's a host of providers and services you can invest. If you do get one through your employer, you can it's probably just easiest to open up a personal account through that same service. However, they do not. Fidelity is still good to use. You can open an account directly with Vanguard. As a rule of thumb, anything related to Vanguard is probably good. Additionally, TD Ameritrade is decent and reliable. I use TD Ameritrade. Charles Schwab is good. Your bank might also provide these services. If you plan on just investing in Vanguard mutual funds or ETFs, and I'll get into what that means, Vanguard is probably just the best and the easiest, and it's very, very forward. But again, there's a lot of big names in this, and you just got to pick the one that makes the most sense for you, depending on your employer and such, and which is easiest. They're all basically the same. Then the most important thing to consider in choosing your provider is the fees that they charge you. There are generally 3 types of fees, and this is very important for investing in general, is understanding the fees that you're paying. So you have 3 types of fees as I kind of see them. You have fees charged as a percent of money invested. You have fees charged at the purchase or sale of a mutual fund or other investment, sometimes called a load. If you ever hear about like you're paying a load on a investment, that's what this is. And then there's like recurring maintenance fees, like paper filing fees charged to your account. So the first one is really dangerous. The second one is less dangerous. The third one's like, okay. So the first rule, understand the fees that you're paying. Absolutely understand what they mean, how useful that they what you're paying for and what a good range is, and probably it's probably in your best interest to consult someone else in your life and just understand, is this reasonable? Just ask, I'm kind of in the right ballpark here. Second rule, don't pay fees. Third rule, if you are paying more than about 0.15% to own an ETF or mutual/index fund, you're probably paying too much. As a note, ETFs and mutual index funds are basically just pre-made portfolios for you. They diversify risk for you, but I'll get into that. Fourth rule, generally for most stocks, bonds, ETFs, you don't have to pay commissions at the time of purchase or sale. However, you absolutely must keep it under 0.5% of the total money you are investing. Anything greater than that, you're probably getting ripped off. That's just kind of like a rule of thumb. Good thing to keep in mind. Fifth rule, recurring maintenance fees are annoying. They can be avoided. Just call up your provider, whether it's Fidelity, TD Ameritrade, or whoever, and just ask them why you're paying them. Sixth rule, small differences in fees matter a lot. If you don't know what your fees are, find out. And if you don't know if they are too high, they probably are. And this is why that they can be important. So, as the great Michael Scott once said, never, ever, ever, ever pay high fees. John Bogle, Michael Scott. So John Bogle is a guy, you might have heard of him. He's basically the big guy on passive investing. He a couple years ago published this PDF, this report, basically on the inefficiency of fees and how they cost you money in the long run. So definitely read through this. The only difference here is this is a growth of a $10,000 investment based on all-in after-tax costs, assuming a 7% gross annual return on stocks. The only difference is over here in the fees that you're paying. So as you can kind of see, the actively managed fund, which is this dotted line, pays an expense ratio of 1.1%. versus the index fund at 0.06%. They have that 0.5% transaction cost at the beginning for putting money in. Oh, actually, sorry, that's a sales charge. And they have a couple other costs in there as well. So what does that look like over the years? It's about the difference between $131,000 at the end of it and $48,000 at the end of it. Small difference. You may only think, oh, well, this is only like 2%. What's the difference? In the long run, it's going to end up mattering a lot. So as low as you can get this expense ratio as possible, is the better off you'll be in the long run. Okay, I'm going to erase that. So question that often gets asked is, like, what should I buy and when should I buy? Like, is it a good time to buy? Should I buy the market right now? Well, here's the smart personal finance advice that I'll give. Put your money in a Vanguard target retirement fund linked to the year which you wish to retire. It's super easy. They auto-adjust your portfolio based on when you are going to retire, what your diversification of risk is. They'll make it less risky as you get older, and they'll do everything on the back end for you for very cheap. And here's a link. You can go there, call them, ask them to set it up for you. Super easy. You'll probably never have to think about anything ever. It'll be very easy for you to manage through that. Now, that's the smart advice. The next 4 slides, just ignore if you only want the smart advice. But if you don't want the smart advice, I'm going to talk about, there's a lot of words on this, but it's basically just walking through what I would do if you're not going to follow that strategy. So at the moment of full disclosure, I'm currently holding about 88% of the S&P 500, 6% cash, 1% government bonds, and 5% individual stocks. I only hold individual stocks because I'm dumb and like to just mess around a little bit on my own. But if you wish to try it on your own and have slightly more control over your money, but you'll have to think about it. I highly suggest you just buy S&P 500 ETFs and mutual funds when buying stocks. So if you don't know what the S&P 500 is, it's one of the three largest major stock indices in the United States. It owns a size-weighted proportion of the 500 largest companies in the U.S. For reference, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook represent about 25 to 30% of it. The other two major indices are the Dow and the NASDAQ. The Dow is primarily industrial companies, whereas the NASDAQ is more information technology companies. The difference between ETFs and mutual funds is ETFs trade all the time throughout the day, whereas mutual funds give you a price at the next close of the market. Really, essentially the same thing for the most part. Sometimes your employer will make you report on ETFs, but not on mutual funds, so they can be a little bit easier using a mutual fund, but they're kind of, for most purposes, they're the same. Only buy stock ETFs from. This is again just high level advice. There's a lot of ETFs out there that aren't that reliable, and so as a rule of thumb, if you buy something that's from BlackRock, iShares, Vanguard, State Street, Invesco, Schwab, or Fidelity, you'll be safe. So I would really only suggest buying something from outside of that if you fully read and understand the prospectus. And when you go on to purchase something, that'll kind of explain itself. I would also suggest only buying stock ETFs linked to the S&P 500, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, or the NASDAQ Composite Index, which are those three indices that I talked about before, unless you have fully read and understand the prospectus. For reference, I only buy VOO. VOO is the ticker. It's an ETF linked to the S&P 500 provided by Vanguard. It has the lowest fee that I found, so it's about 0.03%. It's basically just buying the entire U.S. stock exposure. Additionally, as a side note, and I'm not going to get into this too much, but if you're managing this yourself, and this is why I kind of suggest using the Vanguard Target Retirement Fund, because they do this for you, you probably will want some non-U.S. exposure as well. As you see, I don't currently have non-U.S. exposure, but that's just a personal decision I made. But the reason for having non-U.S. exposure is basically if the United States blows up and the rest of the world doesn't. If you can kind of imagine that scenario. So one of the a good one is I would suggest VEU. It protects this will protect you against U.S. risk. Possibly also consider putting 20 to 30% of your money into this. Remember to reinvest dividends. I'll explain that in a little bit, but this is a reference back to that. Now, as you get older, you'll probably want to diversify into bonds a little bit more. So I would follow similar rules. Bond ETFs from BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Invesco, Schwab, Fidelity, unless you've read the prospectus. A good one is BND. I think this is the total bond market. So it's basically just all U.S. bonds. For both, so talking about the dividends reinvested, certain ETFs and stocks and bonds, they'll give you that interest, or in terms of stocks, it's a dividend, and bonds, it's more interest, but it's the same thing. Basically, it's money that they return to shareholders to you for owning it. So if you own a share of an S&P 500, if you own a share of VOO, for example, what I buy, I think the return is like 1.5% a year. So they basically, if I own $100 of VOO, they'll give me $1.50 every year for that $100 in cash in my account. When you're young, you'll want to reinvest these back into the ETF that you own. So you can go through on your account if you're buying individual ETFs, and you can make sure that you check there's like a reinvest dividends, and it'll do it all automatically. But the reason for that is kind of similar to the fees thing. Imagine you're taking money out every year from your investment. It's going to have compounding effects later on. So because you just end up be sitting on cash and you wouldn't have that cash invested, but that's just more savings that you have. So by investing it back into the ETF and clicking that little checkbox in your um, investment account, you'll be able to capitalize on more returns. And like I said, the target retirement plan automatically does a lot of this for you, which is why I suggest it. It's super easy and it's probably the smart personal finance advice. It's also, you're going to like have to take, you'll have to think about it less. Next, I'm going to talk about if you do choose to go on yourself, understand certain things. Understand the risk you're taking. A lot of people lose money because they don't even know the risk that they're taking. For example, if they own if they own a lot of a debt or a stock with a lot of debt on it, they're taking a lot of risk that maybe that the debt is worth something, but the equity's not, or they're taking risks like if you're just in the United States, if you like where I said here, if you only buy VU or US stocks, you're taking that risk that the US blows up and Europe doesn't. So by at least knowing those risks, you can help yourself understand how to position yourself a little bit better. So talking about this, these are not absolutes, but generally we assume the following long-term returns when we think about different asset classes. Stocks, about 7% a year. That's just like a rule of thumb. Bonds, 4% a year. And then the risk-free rate, US Treasuries, money markets, et cetera, 2% per year. So if you're going to put your money in stocks, it'll probably grow at about 7% per year, bonds 4%, risk-free, US Treasuries, et cetera. They change, but right now, or as a long run number, we'll kind of consider 2% in that bucket. Reason stocks have higher reward is because they have higher risk and more volatility. Bonds are seen as less risky, and than stocks with lower volatility. So stocks, the price might move up and down a lot more. If I think down in this third bullet point over here, if you have your money invested 100% in stock, just understand that probably, and you have that for 40 years, at some point your money is going to go down 40%. So the good bad advice is, if you don't need your money for 5 years and you don't plan on retiring for 5 to 7 years, as a reminder, you should only have money invested that you don't touch until you retire. You should really just be in 100% stock, and just take the extra, absorb the volatility and the risk, because you're in a position that you're able to do that. If that doesn't make sense, then I can explain it again. Basically, if you can take a higher return in just a diversified stock portfolio as you're younger, when you don't need money in the future, in the long run, that'll help you a lot. But as you get older and in 5 to 7 years before retirement, you should phase your money into 100% bonds because these are less risky. And you should probably stop reinvesting the dividends in both stocks and the bonds. But again, this is kind of like a financial advisor will talk you through all this, and this is why they can be good. But the key for taking a financial advisor, and I should have mentioned this back here, if they charge you a percent of assets each year, you're gonna lose a lot of money to this. So that's why you want to use like a fee-based one, where it's basically you only pay like, I don't know, say $1,000 a year or $500 a year, and then as your money grows, they're not taking more of your money over time. Okay, and then keep in mind, so going back to owning 100% stock, that when you need your money the most, your stocks and bonds will also be worth the least. So this is why this is a riskier strategy. Like if you lose your job and you need to end up drawing on your investment account, it's probably at a similar time that the stock market will be down 30% or 40%, and you'll have to sell low and you'll lose money and the whole thing will break down. So I would only suggest being in 100% stock for a long period of time if you have established a risk tolerance that you're comfortable with, and if you can avoid selling down after large price changes at all costs. Because again, if you're forced to sell, this whole thing kind of breaks down. I'm going to go a little bit faster here because it's already 8:48. Sorry. So what should you buy? you should, I'm not going to get into this too much, actually. So if you're going to buy, you should just buy at the time that you get money, generally, unless you receive a large lump sum of money and you want to feel more comfortable in investing it. You could dollar cost average it, which I explain right here. Um, and then a lot of people talk like, should I buy company X? As a rule of thumb, I highly advise against buying individual stocks. Sometimes I do it because, again, I'm just dumb and it's fun. It's kind of like, but it kind of can be interesting. My boss says that like you buying individual stocks is kind of like think about it kind of like going to Vegas. You're doing it with money that you have, and you understand you could lose, but you could make money and you could lose it, but you're really just doing it for, you're kind of just doing it for enjoyment. There's really no other reason to do so. And so I would say, understand that there's people that spend a lot of time researching it, thoroughly what you're buying, and they are only right 49% of the time. Second, understand that get a higher return, you're taking more risk. So usually if your stock's going up a lot, there's a higher risk associated with that. If you consistently beat the market with a portfolio of stocks you construct on your own, you're either consistently taking more risk or you've gotten lucky, probably. I only suggest you buy a stock if it's a new service or product or whatever which you know of, and which you are, or you or your friend is an early adopter. So like new products are great because especially when you're young, if you're like using something new, it's like, oh my God, this is great. I know that this is gonna be a big hit. That might be a time. And then second, this is a crash course on this is a crash course on what to know when you're buying a stock. I'm not gonna get into this super in depth, but basically, know its ticker. So a lot of people will make a mistake, for example, with like Zoom versus for the company Zoom Technologies we're using right now, and they'll buy ZOOM, and it's like this company that has no value that's gone up like 300% because people are buying the wrong company, and that'll eventually in the long run like not work. Know its enterprise value, its market cap. This is basically how big the company is, the money it makes. Again, I'm not going to get into this, but as much because I don't think it's as relevant for everyone. But understand that these things I'll talk about. If you know something unique, you should buy. That's a good time to buy. The bigger the company, the less likely it is that you know something unique. For example, if the company's bigger market cap of a market cap bigger than $2 billion, it's very unlikely that you know something unique because so people research those companies extensively. This is why I suggest you only buy individual stocks if you're an earlier adopter or products or services. Think about the costs associated with what they sell, and if you think they can sell it profitably, and think about defensible competitive advantages that they have. Continuing, this is broad-based. Important thing to understand is the difference between long-term and short-term capital gains. Short-term capital gains occur when you sell an asset or stock or bond less than a year after you purchase it. When you sell something that you purchased and it's grown and it's made you money and it's gained money and value, you have to pay taxes on it. If you sell before a year after you purchase it, those are going to be taxed as normal income. Whereas if you sell after a year, those are going to be taxed at a level between 0% and 20%, depending on your income level. So this is why like people with higher income levels will end up holding stocks for greater than a year because they'll be able to sit, like the highest marginal tax rate is like, I think like 37% or something like that. So they'd save 17% on selling it by holding it for longer than a year. You can evaluate whether or not it's a good time or a bad time to sell a stock based on looking at what your income your tax level is from that earlier tax calculator that I was talking about and evaluating here. But as an example, if you are single and make less than $40,000 a year, your long-term capital gains rate is 0%. So if you buy a stock, hold it for longer than a year, and you make less than $40,000 a year, you will pay 0% taxes on it. So just understand the differences in the tax rates that you pay and how to kind of optimize that. One thing I did want to talk about today is the difference between, so kind of done with the investing section. I'm going to try to get through this fairly quickly. One thing I did want to talk about is the difference between good debt and bad debt. So as a rule of thumb, debt with an interest rate less than 4% is considered good. it means that you're losing less than 4% a year for using someone else's money. So if you kind of think about it, if you were to then take that money and invest it at, say, that 7% you're making in the stock market, you'd be making 3% a year. So you'd be making like more than 3% a year, or be making 3% a year. Sorry, got distracted. But understand that incurs a higher risk. So you'd have to be able to deal with more volatility. So that goes back to that don't sell low concept. So make sure you can cover that 4%. So going back, this means for debt less than 4% a year costs you. So if you borrow $100 and you only have to pay $4 a year for that, it's probably best to just make the minimum payments if you have a fairly stable job and income level. But you got to think about that as a risk of if you can't cover your debts if you lose your job. This kind of breaks down in a area around 4% to 7%, so less than 7%, but greater than 4%. This math doesn't work as well, and it becomes more formidable. So to generally advise against carrying a lot of debt with interest rates higher than 4%. And then here's as a rule of thumb, debt with an interest rate greater than 7% is bad, 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 bad. Always pay off these debts immediately, as they generally mean you are losing money each year. For example, going back to that stock market return number, if you are to borrow at, say, 8% and invest even at that 7%, you're losing 1% a year. So it's in your best interest to pay that money down right away, because you can't use it to make more money generally. Here's a good link to good debt versus bad debt. Understanding the concept of debt, I think, is very important, because I was texting John Archibald, if anyone knows him, and he was saying that he usually tells people good debt is what makes people rich, and bad debt is what I forget exactly the quote, but it's basically I'll bring it up. He said, I usually say that rich people have tons of good debt and poor people have tons of bad debt, and people's ears perk up. And I think it can kind of be true. It's like if you're drowning in debt and you're always paying more money, then if you're losing that % a year or 2% a year, the odds are against you. So you want to pay down that debt as quickly as possible. But if you have the ability to borrow at a low rate and invest at a higher rate or whatever, that could be in your best interest. So one of the biggest offenders of this is credit card companies. Understand, no matter what, credit card companies, they're in the business of making money and making money from you. So they make money when you spend money. When you feel like you have money, you spend more money. This is kind of one of those biases that we were talking about earlier. Credit cards are designed to make you feel like you have more money. If you recognize this bias, though, they can be useful and they can have utility. Talking about the present value, a lot of credit card companies will offer you cash back. So, for example, the present value of 40 years of 1% cash back, if you were to spend $2,000 a month and your purchases grow at about 3% a year, the present value of those savings is $5,000. So say you spend $2,000 in this year per month, and then next year you spend $2,060 per month. And then the year after, 2,120 or whatever it is. You save that. If you get 1% cash back on all those purchases, in those savings, that's worth about $5,000, me giving you $5,000 today. Now that is still valuable savings, because you could say invest that $5,000 in the stock market at 7%, and in 40 years it'd be worth $70,000. But there's things that break down the utility of that $5,000. Annual fees, for example, can break down the utility of credit cards unless you're getting a lot of benefits, but you have to use those benefits. But keep in mind that those benefits are incentivized to make you spend more money. Additionally, spending more money breaks down the utility of the credit cards. This is why I highly, highly suggest just using the credit card as a cashback mechanism to shuffle transactions through to your checking account. That budget that we established earlier, it really should just be a funnel directly through that, so you can get those savings. They can help you build credit, and that is useful for maybe buying a house. But other things that can help you build credit are like paying off student debts, paying rent, and paying utilities. Um, so additionally, I would suggest that get cash back. If you can get cash back on a card, is probably best, and pay off your statement frequently. Else, otherwise, if you're sitting on points or invested cash or uninvested cash, that money is getting less valuable over time because of that inflation. Like those points become less valuable. So it's in your best interest to just use those as frequently as possible, because you're not losing money on just sitting on points. Additionally, always pay your credit card statement down so you don't incur a high interest rate. Just pay down right away. Don't carry a balance. They put up interest rates of like 18% sometimes. Even if you're 18 to like 30%, it can be very bad. And so it just never makes sense to pay interest on a credit card. Now we're going to talk about housing and cars. So the last two. Most people are probably far away from this. But just some rules of thumb, I figured I'd throw them in here. You should only buy a house if you can put 20% down. Homes generally are not seen as investments unless you are in the business of renting them out and you cover your costs each month. And this is because there's costs that are not just interest costs in your loan. You have property taxes, you have maintenance and upkeep, you have HOA fees, you have insurance, you have more. Some of these can be tax deductible. It's good to understand which those are, but these costs generally make it difficult for you to actually make money in the long run on just the appreciation of your house. So a lot of people will assume, oh, my house will increase 6% a year. That may or may not happen. As a good rule of thumb, assume it won't happen, because even if it appreciates maybe 3% a year, just assume that you're going to put 3% a year in maintenance costs into your house. And the reason this is a good assumption is because they can get you into trouble if you just assume that things will go up, the price of your house will go up. You can end up underwater on your house, which means that you maybe you bought a house for, say, $100,000, and you put 20% down, so you put $20,000 down, and now you have to sell your house, but that house now is only worth $50,000. So if you can only sell the house for $50,000, but you still owe $80,000, even if you sell the house for the $50,000, you'll still owe $30,000. So that's the definition of being underwater on a home. That happened, and that's what a lot of the issues in 2006, 2007, 2008 were. A lot of people just assumed that their houses would go up in value because they were going up in value, and it messed a lot of people up. In terms of whether or not you should own or buy, generally whether or not you should own or rent, renting provides you more financial flexibility. So if your income's changing, if you don't have a very stable income, if you don't think you can commit to a 30-year mortgage, renting can actually just be useful. It could make you more asset light, and you could then put that 20% down that you would have put on a house into the stock market, because that's that opportunity cost that I was talking about earlier, and it would grow on its own. And then, so generally, if you want to buy a home, I would suggest you use a fixed rate mortgage, so you can plan for a lot of your expenses. And just when you're buying a home, remember what good debt is and what bad debt is, that 4% threshold. The reason I suggest a fixed rate mortgage is because interest rates can change. The Fed can increase rates, they can decrease rates, and you may not realize that your costs to paying your interest on your house are going to actually go up. Again, this happened to a lot of people in 2006. People used a lot of variable interest mortgages and ended up owing more and more money each year as the Fed raised rates. Lastly, cars. Generally, I suggest you buy a car only if you can afford to pay for it in cash. And the reason for this is because cars are a depreciating asset. Sometimes companies will offer 0% financing. If it really is 0% financing, you might consider taking it. But they may be tricking you by simply just charging you more for the car or making you feel like you can afford a more expensive car. So I would suggest take it 0% interest if you can afford to buy the car in cash. And the reason for that, again, is that cars are a depreciating asset. They lose value each year. So there's actually just a cost to owning them. Additionally, there's moving on, similar things, save up to pay for cars, put savings into your money market account and take it out when it's time to buy. That's probably a good way to save up for a car. If you can't afford to save up for a car, you should probably just buy a cheaper car, a used car. And then lastly, just to reiterate, cars are depreciating assets. So try to keep them as long as you can. Keep them for 10 years if you can. Additionally, understand that you'll end up putting more money into them each year. It's an ongoing expense. You'll have to maybe put $2,000 to $3,000 to $4,000 a year just in maintenance later in its life. So that's an additional expense there. That is basically all I had. If anyone has any questions, feel free to chime in. If not, I will just conclude shortly. I'll give it like a minute or so. Can you share the slides? Yeah, I'll share the slides. I'm going to send a replay of this, and I'll probably just post it on YouTube and then just share the link. That's probably the easiest way. But I can also just send them around. Cool. Again, this is just advice that I would give. Oh, well, I got a question. One question.
Calts, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I
Yeah.
don't feel like typing it, but I've heard a lot of like personal finance, um, like articles or things like that suggest people buy disability insurance.
Yep.
What do you think about that?
I guess it would depend largely on your job. I know a lot of disability insurance is offered through work. I think it's fairly inexpensive it's maybe, especially if you're young, it's fairly inexpensive. I would say keep in mind what your disability insurance covers you for. But it's kind of similar to the life insurance thing. So I can kind of talk about this here. The reason to buy term life insurance or whole life insurance is to protect people that you care about later on if something bad were to happen. So I would say that disability insurance probably along the same lines. If you're protecting yourself, especially when you're younger, if it's only, it depends on how expensive it is and what it covers you. I imagine you can get it fairly cheap. So putting a couple bucks a year into disability insurance in the off chance that something bad would happen I would say that's a good thing to do. But again, depends on the price, and I'm sure you can do a little bit of research on like online to get reasonable range.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a thing where that it seems like it's becoming more and more like popular. I'm hearing more about it, but I don't know if it's actually just like some kind of like underground marketing tactic for like people to sell disability insurance.
I know there's a lot of that. I guess it really depends on what you cover. I think my work, for example, like pushes us automatically into disability insurance. And I think when I was signing up for stuff, I don't actually know that off the top of my head, but I think when I was signing up for stuff, they put me into it. And I think I pay like $2 a year or $2 a month or something like that, or paycheck for it. But we didn't have like a choice to opt out. Again, it depends on if it's injured at work disability insurance or other disability insurance. I can't imagine it's that bad a thing. But again, like with most of that, you can kind of look up if it's a scam or not. I don't know too much about that though.
All right. The only other question I had is there a general like rule of thumb that you've seen for like how long like you should intend to like live in a house if you're buying it?
I don't know the answer to that. I would
Like
say
when is like a good like because obviously if you're like gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna move to this area for a year, like or like 2 years, I'm gonna buy a house. And like I feel like a lot of people say that doesn't make sense, but is there like a general like
I think I've heard 5 to 7 years as a rule of thumb. And the reason for that is that you end up putting in a lot of closing costs in up front, especially with your if you get a mortgage. And I think because closing costs can end up being $10,000, $20,000 or whatever. And so if you're turning over more than about about once every 5 to 7 years, those closing costs don't really make as much sense as opposed to just getting um, and the kind of the hassle of it all, as opposed to just getting a rental. Um, I would say it, but if you think you can afford the home and you um, look at the closing costs and divide the closing costs by the number of years that you're going to stay there, and then multiply them by two, because you might have costs on the way out to pay for someone buying your house, paying like a realtor. Um, so just understand and then be like, okay, add that into the cost of owning that house that year. So 2 years probably doesn't make sense to own, um, but 5 to 7 years, 5 years plus probably makes sense. Cool. If no one else has any other questions, I'll close it there. Again, this is just like some advice that I think is useful to know. It's not the right advice. It's not the wrong advice. It's just good advice, and I think it is helpful to people to at least try to understand. If you can at least understand some of this, your ability to make financial decisions on your own will be helped greatly. So it can be beneficial for you in the long run. Just to kind of be aware of these things and confront them as opposed to just like ignoring them. Um, Again, because like it'll just set you up in the long run in a better position to take advantage of those compounding returns, that 7% a year, grow money. If you save money now, you'll just be in a much better position in the long run. So again, I'll just close out and I recorded this and I'll post it on YouTube and send it out. All right. See ya.
Unmuted claps. Woo. Yeah, hit me with that link.
Uh,
I will.